ถึงอีกหนึ่งช่วงนะคะซึ่งก็น่าจะเป็นอีกหนึ่งช่วงที่สำคัญของงานสัมมนาในวันนี้เพราะเราจะได้มีโอกาสรับฟังมุมมองของผู้เชี่ยวชาญด้านสิทธิมนุษยชนในระดับสากลวันนี้เราได้รับเกียรติจากทาง Walk Free ค่ะซึ่งเป็นหน่วยงาน NGO ด้านสิทธิมนุษยชนระหว่างประเทศแล้วก็ได้มีบทบาทในการสนับสนุนการยุติใช้แรงงานทาสยุคใหม่ในทุกรูปแบบด้วยอีกทั้งยังเป็นผู้เชี่ยวชาญในการจัดทำดัชนีตัวชี้วัดด้านแรงงานทาสของโลกแล้วก็มีส่วนสำคัญนะคะในการร่วมรณรงค์เพื่อสนับสนุนการดำเนินงานของภาครัฐภาคธุรกิจภาคการลงทุนให้ขับเคลื่อนตามแนวปฏิบัติที่ดีในด้านของสิทธิมนุษยชนค่ะนอกจากนี้นะคะเราก็ได้รับเกียรติจากทาง Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking หรือว่า FAST ค่ะซึ่งเป็นหน่วยงานที่มีบทบาทในการเป็นศูนย์วิจัยเชิงนโยบายขององค์การสหประชาชาติที่มีเป้าหมายในการขับเคลื่อนให้ภาคการเงินมีบทบาทต่อต้านการใช้แรงงานทาสยุคใหม่แล้วก็การค้ามนุษย์ทั่วโลกอีกด้วยนะคะซึ่งท่านวิทยากรที่จะให้เกียรติมาบรรยายในช่วง Introduction of Guidance on Modern Slavery Risk for Thai Business นี้ประกอบไปด้วยคุณเซรีนาแกรนท์Head of Business Engagement from Walk Free และคุณ Daniel Telescuff Project Director from Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking นะคะซึ่งทั้งสองท่านจะมาบรรยายนะคะโดยจะเริ่มต้นที่คุณเซรีนาจากนั้นก็จะเป็นการบรรยายของคุณ Daniel ตามลำดับท่านวิทยากรน่าจะพร้อมอยู่แล้วทั้งสองท่านเลยขอเรียนเชิญค่ะ
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Wanwanyat, for your introduction. Unfortunately, Grace Forrest was unable to join us to present today, but on behalf of Grace and Walk Free, I'd like to thank the Stock Exchange of Thailand and Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking for your great collaboration and partnership throughout this project. Each of your contributions to this project have helped set a new standard for businesses in Thailand and for markets across the globe. Walk Free is an international human rights group working to accelerate the end of modern slavery in all its forms. Walk Free's Global Slavery Index found that in 2016, 1 in every 200 people, that is over 40 million people globally, were living in modern slavery. And 16 million of those people were enslaved in global supply chains. New Global Slavery Index figures are due out next year, and while we cannot foreshadow those numbers today, I can tell you this with great certainty. No business sector is free of modern slavery, and no country is immune. Modern slavery will continue to thrive unless we take urgent and lasting action. That is why Walk Free works with governments, regulators, businesses, and faith leaders to create lasting systems change. We forge strong partnerships to solve difficult problems. And in the Stock Exchange of Thailand, we have found a strong partner dedicated to making business sustainable for both planet and people. This partnership comes at a vital moment. Over the course of the last 2 years, hundreds of millions of people have slipped below the poverty line. Many migrant workers lost jobs and were stranded by travel restrictions due to COVID. These conditions allowed human trafficking and exploitation to flourish. For the first time since the last World War, global supply chains have been radically disrupted, publicly exposing the prevalence of extremely exploitative business practices. And for the first time in 2 decades, the child labour estimates have gone up, finding that 1 in 10 children globally are working and not in school. Throughout the pandemic, the world's most vulnerable people, those whose jobs are critical to global supply chains, have been hit first and hit the hardest. We need businesses to take action to help safeguard these workers and eliminate modern slavery from their supply chains. Business leaders now have the opportunity to adopt a new KPI. Is my business free of modern slavery? To achieve this KPI, I think we will need to turn to business leaders and ask for their guidance and their innovation. What are the new models of business that put workers first? And how do we ensure that everyone is treated fairly? How do we ensure that global supply chains are founded on this fairness? The answers to these questions might be different for every business. It may involve engaging more closely with your workforce and listening to their concerns. Or you may need to change recruitment practices to ensure workers do not have to pay to get a job. And for others, it might mean requiring your customers to pay more to reflect the real cost of labour in your supply chain. As we ask these questions, it's essential that we listen to those who are most impacted, survivors of modern slavery and labour exploitation, and workers who may be vulnerable. Listening to these workers and ensuring that their voices are heard is a critical part of businesses' responsibility to respect human rights and to create truly sustainable business models that are based on fairness. So, I invite you to use this guidance, innovate, and then tell us how to improve the guidance. Show us the new business models that safeguard workers and eradicate modern slavery. If we could now turn to the slides, I'll provide you with some more details about the guidance and tool. As you can see here, we have an overview and introduction in the first section of the guidance. The second part of the guidance, section B, focuses on key risks in Thailand on an industry basis across the 8 different industries listed on the Stock Exchange of Thailand. And section C is a checklist. This is intended to be a practical tool for companies and really lists actions on what companies should do to identify and address labour risks in their supply chain, and crucially, how they should be reporting on these issues through their sustainability reporting. Next slide, please. In the introduction, we cover questions such as what is modern slavery, how prevalent is it globally, and how does it impact business value chains in Thailand? Next slide, please. Modern slavery refers to situations where one person has taken away another person's freedom. Their freedom to control their body, their freedom to refuse certain work or to stop working so that they can be exploited. Many people think this freedom is often taken away through physical restraint. You may think of the historical context of slavery or handcuffs or chains, but often the reality is that this freedom is taken away through threats, violence, coercion, abuse of power and deception. While modern slavery is not defined at law, it's an umbrella term that covers a number of different crimes, including human trafficking, forced labour, debt bondage, and the worst forms of child labour. Next slide, please. This is taken from the guidance and highlights the 11 indicators of forced labour from the International Labour Organization. With each of these indicators, you can see underneath there's a quote on how this might impact a worker. So, for example, on restriction of movement, I'm not allowed to leave or communicate with anyone outside. Again, this is intended to be a more practical way for companies to think about how these indicators might be impacting workers. Next slide, please. This next slide shows the global prevalence of modern slavery. As you can see there, and that the numbers I mentioned earlier, 40.3 million people are estimated to be living in modern slavery. And this is a gendered issue. It impacts women and girls disproportionately, with 71% of victims being women. You can see there the prevalence on a country-by-country basis, and over 60% of victims of modern slavery are in that Asia-Pacific region. Next slide, please. Knowing these statistics, I think it's safe to say that modern slavery impacts every industry and every value chain in the world. So it's therefore up to businesses to identify where these risks are occurring and to take action. Next slide, please. Within the guidance, we've broken down these industry risks to look at the 8 sectors listed on the Stock Exchange of Thailand: agro and food, consumer products, property and construction, resources, financials, industrials, services, and technology. You can see here we have an example of one of these industries, property and construction, and we've got a high-level snapshot here of some of the risks that might occur in that sector. As you can see, there are lots of labour-related risks with widespread use of temporary, short-term and day labourers, as well as widespread use of contractors and subcontractors, making the supply chains fairly opaque. Wages are commonly below minimum wage, and both accommodation and working conditions can be unsafe. Next slide, please. The final part of the guidance is the checklist. So as I mentioned, this is intended to be a very practical tool for companies. And again, this checklist is in 3 parts. It provides a summary of what the business should do to identify and address modern slavery risks. It has key questions so that you can test your progress as you go through, and it gives guidance on what companies should be reporting. And this guidance is very timely given the new introduction of mandatory sustainability reporting in Thailand, which is coming in January. So we think this is a really handy tool for businesses who will be reporting under the One Report on sustainability issues to give them guidance on how they can address social risks and particularly modern slavery within their sustainability reporting. Next slide, please. Within the checklist, we've divided it into 3 categories. So there's governance and policy, risk assessment and due diligence, and grievance mechanism, response and remediation. Throughout the guidance, I think, we've tried very hard to align it with international standards, and it's very much based on the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, as well as other normative frameworks, such as the core International Labour Organization conventions. Next slide, please. Here's where I have to start reading Thai. This is a snapshot of the modern slavery benchmarking tool. This is an interactive tool, and this is very much based on section C of the guidance, the checklist. Within the tool, companies are able to answer questions. It's a survey and it's anonymous, so companies don't need to put in their company name if they don't wish to. The second, if you could go to the next slide, please. Once the companies have completed the survey about their risk management practices, they'll be given a score, and you can see there that that score is also broken down in terms of how they did in relation to each section of the tool. The score is also, you can compare it to others in your industry, so you can benchmark your score against your peers, as well as the overall average. Together with the benchmarking score, you'll be given a short report, as you can see on the screen now. And this really covers what the company is doing well. So you'll sort of receive a checklist of the key actions that your company is already taking. The middle column shows areas where the company can improve. So these are the priority actions that you should take to improve your practices. And finally, the third column shows what you should be disclosing in relation to that issue. So again, giving some more guidance on sustainability reporting. Thank you very much. I think that's the end of the presentation, and I'd just like to once again thank the Stock Exchange of Thailand for their leadership and their vision in working with us on this project, and also to FAST for their continued partnership and the work we've been doing with them to mobilise the financial sector to combat slavery and trafficking. Thank you very much, and I'll now hand over to Daniel.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon to Thailand. Sorry for the short introduction. Thanks a lot, Serena. Thanks also to you and your entire team for the great work you have been doing. You have really done the heavy lifting. It's a huge contribution that Walk-Free has done for this project, and I think we felt very privileged to be part of that journey, and also to our colleagues, of course, at the SCT, and for their engagement and their leadership. Just a brief introduction. My name is Daniel Telesklav. I'm the project director of Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, which is a program at the United Nations University's Center for Policy Research here in New York. My background is more on financial crime, anti-money laundering. I was the head of the financial intelligence unit in Liechtenstein and in Switzerland. And I was for a few years chairing the European anti-money laundering watchdog called Moneyval. And I had also a role at the global level as a co-chair of the Financial Action Task Force Working Group on Risk Trends and Methods after a stint at the Basel Institute on Governance. So next slide, please. All our work is based on a report that we have presented to the United Nations General Assembly 2 years ago, which we called the Blueprint. The Blueprint is the result of joint work of the private sector and of the public sector, including NGOs, academia, UN organizations, but also survivors. We have put together a commission of 25 experts that included all these different parts, and we elaborated on a very practical set of recommendations addressed to the financial sector, how this sector can contribute to end trafficking and slavery. And this is a first and very important conclusion, that if we want to achieve this goal, we really have to reach out to the private sector and bring them in to contribute to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The Blueprint, our report, recognized in particular the important role that regulators have. They certainly play a very key role in preventing unfair market competition by excluding from the marketplace those firms that rely on forced labor. The very existence of slavery and trafficking is the result of a market failure. So we need regulation to correct that. The market alone will not be in a position to end modern slavery and human trafficking. And that regard, the Blueprint was specific about the role stock and commodity exchanges can have through listing rules and also using environmental, social and governance, the so-called ESG guidance and indices to encourage compliance with laws. Next slide, please. And we very much welcome that the SCT has responded to that call so quickly and so effectively. So the guidance that we are launching today, and that Serena has introduced, it's the first of its kind in Thailand. And I think it's the first of its kind in Southeast Asia. It directly responds to our blueprint or our recommendation to use market regulation to enforce the ban on trafficking, forced labor, and other forms of modern slavery. So these forms are already criminalized. What it takes now is real steps towards implementation. I think the guidance is really notably detailed, and as Serena has set out, it provides you with an overview of industry-specific risks and targeted questions that you can ask yourself. So we very much hope that you would use it, and you would also feed back to us how you used it and what your experience was. The guidance will ultimately also increase transparency in the Thai economy. It will support corporate alignment with the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. And it will help address many of the causal and contributing factors that place vulnerable populations at greater risk, and as we have to say, increasing risks of modern slavery since the outbreak of the global pandemic. Also, the guidance could help increase access to effective remedy for victims of modern slavery. For us, like for Walk Free, survivors play a fundamentally important role in our program. And if we don't manage to provide remedy to survivors, we have failed. But this guidance can contribute to actually allowing that. So certainly, going forward, we will be very much committed to continue to work with Walk Free and the SCT, both on the implementation of the guidance and see what went well and where we have to improve, but also to engage with other stock exchanges, to convince them to follow the excellent example that SCT has set. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I really commend you on the hard work you have been doing, and I wish all the companies at the Thai Stock Exchange good luck in the implementation and in the use of the guidance. Thank you very much.
มีคำถามเข้ามาแล้ว 2 คำถามด้วยกันนะคะ เข้าใจว่าทั้งคุณเซรีนาแล้วก็คุณแดเนียลน่าจะได้ไปคนละ 1 คำถาม เพราะฉะนั้นขออนุญาตช่วงนี้เข้าสู่ Q&A เลยนะคะคำถามแรกเป็นของคุณเซรีนานะคะเซรีนา could you please help answer to this question Hello
Yes, hello.
Serena
Yes, thank
Can
you.
you hear
That's
me?
I can hear you. That's
Okay.
a great question.
Okay. This question is how do you think investors are engaging on this issue of modern slavery? Do you expect to see more focus on the S or social in ESG? Please.
Thank you. And yes, we do. This is something we've been talking about a lot with asset owners and asset managers. And, I think we've seen so much great progress on the climate or environmental side with both companies and investors adopting standards such as TCFD and starting to see these as material financial risks. So while progress has been slower on the social or human rights risks, we are starting to see a lot more interest from investors. And I say this talking from direct experience. So Walk Free is currently working with Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking, or IAST, which is a group of over 30 investors with 7.7 trillion in assets under management. And these investors are working to engage companies to improve supply chain practices and combat modern slavery. We've seen similar investor initiatives like this in Europe and in the US, and I'd expect to see a lot more action being taken on human rights risks globally. This is particularly so with the introduction of mandatory human rights due diligence laws in Europe, as well as increasing regulation of supply chain transparency reporting laws around the world. I think these new laws will increase the amount of information that companies are reporting on and hopefully also the quality of the information. And I think as that information improves, investors will be able to use that information and they'll be better equipped to factor it into their investment decisions. So yes, thanks. In summary, I would expect to see a lot more focus on the S in ESG and specifically because modern slavery is such a grave human rights risk, I think that is a really big priority area for companies to be focusing on and indeed for investors to be asking companies about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serena. Okay, next, I hope Daniel could help answer this question. So are you ready, Daniel? Okay. Many large financial institutions are listed on stock exchanges. Could you elaborate on the role of financial institutions to end modern slavery, please?
Thank you. That's a great question. I believe the reason why we focused on the financial sector is because finance is a lever by which the entire global economy can be moved. And clearly, as I said before, we have to bring in the global economy, the private sector, to meet the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And our work has always been to work in partnership with the financial sector. The sector is connected to trafficking and slavery in 3 ways. Firstly, it handles the proceeds of crime. And we're speaking here of an amount of $150 billion generated every year by trafficking and slavery offenders. But also the sector invests in and lends to businesses benefiting from the exploitation of labor. And thirdly, and last but not least, by providing financial services, the sector can significantly reduce vulnerabilities and make an important contribution to prevention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So no more question for you guys. So thank you very much for joining us today, Serena and Daniel.